Hi everyone, my name is Courtney and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be discussing the Chaos Walking trilogy by Patrick Ness. I'm going to summarize it, I'm going to review the series, and then I'm going to get into the main title of this video. Does the Chaos Walking trilogy stand up? 5-6 years ago when I first started BookTube, the Chaos Walking trilogy was everywhere. It was very popular, heralded as one of the best young adult fantasy sci-fi series of the time, but it was one of those series where people are always like, oh, I don't want to tell you about the plot because I don't want to explain it because you just need to read it for yourself. You know, it needs to remain mysterious kind of a thing, which like I understand wanting to do that, but the first book was published in 2008. It's been 12 years. I think it's okay for us now to discuss the plot and what happens in these books. But if you don't want spoilers, look away because I am going to be discussing the series as a whole. I picked up this series, I want to say in 2017, and I didn't get around to reading the first book until last year. And then I was able to finish the series this year, mainly using audiobooks, which I will get into why I used audiobooks for this reading experience. But a couple years ago, it was announced that there was a movie coming out. I didn't really care about it, to be honest. I'm kind of done with like the YA dystopian paranormal movies, but I still wanted to read the series because I had seen it all over BookTube and I was recommended it. But it's really interesting that this series is getting a movie or got a movie recently because I do think there is a lot of potential in this series and there are a lot of interesting things that I think would lend itself very well. Personally, to me, I think it would lend itself very well to a TV series, and I think this series could be very poignant for a 2021 audience just because of some of the themes that it discusses. But let's get into just a summary of this series. So this is a sci-fi fantasy series, more leaning into the sci-fi aspect. It has some dystopian qualities to it. This is set on an alien planet in an alien world with human beings that have traveled there, and the society that our main character Todd lives in is slightly dystopian. So there are heavy dystopian sci-fi elements to the series, but it does feel very fantastical and less technology-based sci-fi. And with that, the setting is kind of regressed Earthen society. It feels very Western, very settlers, very Oregon Trail, you know, pioneers traveling across the West, taking over land and manifest destiny and all that. But the main plot of this novel is that a 13-year-old boy named Todd lives in this town where there's only men and everybody can hear each other's thoughts. And one day Todd stumbles into something that is complete silence, which he's never heard before. And in that silence he finds a woman, which of course he hasn't seen because all the women mysteriously disappeared in the town or died in the town, I want to say like 13 years ago. So when Todd discovers this young woman, Viola, they both have to escape this town, and basically they are on a wild chase as the town is chasing them to try and capture them. So let's get into my review of the series. I'm going to just give general reasons as to why this wasn't a perfect series for me, but why I could see other people enjoying this. First of all, these are very chunky books. They're very big. This one especially, it's over 600 pages or just a little over 600 pages. And for me, plot-wise, these books didn't really move a lot. The first book is all about just escaping, and eventually the escapes seem to feel very repetitive because it's just, oh, they caught up to us, we have to escape again. Oh, they caught up to us, we have to escape again. Todd struggling with the idea of killing other people, and it's just kind of repeated throughout the first entire book. At the end of the first book, they think they finally escaped and got into the main city, which is like one of the bigger settlements in the area. But of course, the people that were chasing them have formed an army and they've taken over the city. And so now they're living under this repressive regime in the second book. And so the second book, in my opinion, is the most interesting plot-wise, but again, it stays very stationary. Basically, Viola and Todd are separated from each other in this town, and they're both struggling to survive in this city under, you know, the villains. Viola's on the rebel side and Todd is on the main villain's side, and they just kind of have to survive and try and get back together. And then the third book is mainly dealing with the spackle. So spackle are the natural species, human-ish species of this world. I don't know how to say that. They're the alien race of this world. They've been oppressed and taken over, and so that kind of theme of colonization, imperialism, especially like from an indigenous lens, that kind of is bubbling under the surface of the first two books. And in the third and final book, it is the humans versus the spackle in this war. And of course, on the human side, there's all these different factions who are infighting but also the threat of the spackle, and can they find peace together? Will they end up fighting each other and killing each other? So that's the main summary of each of the 3 books, and it very much stays in those things. This is 600 pages about the spackle war, about trying to find peace, and then something bad happening, and then them getting angry at each other, and then it all happening all over again. The second book is all about trying to get back to Viola trying to get back to Todd, just them living their day-to-day lives in this town. You see what I mean? It gets just like very repetitive. For me, it's just that these books were so fascinating. There was so much in this world. There were so many themes that were so interesting to me. But because it stayed so stationary on the same exact themes, the same exact plot points, it didn't feel like it branched out. It felt like it could use some plot points or a breath of fresh air. Like, I wanted this book to be like, yes and the Spackle War, but now we're getting into the next thing. So plot-wise, that's why these books ended up being very much a slog for me. Again, read the audiobooks because I could not get into these, and I could not read these without some kind of audio help. As for the world, again, the world is very interesting. We're in a sci-fi series that is very genre bending, which lends itself to a very interesting world with incredible world building. We only get a glimpse into this world. The stuff we do see is very good and well done. Because it's so expansive, that's why I wanted more of it, because I thought it could have really just been super interesting to explore more of this world. And along with like the world, finally in the third book we get one of the native alien characters actually narrating, and so for the first time we actually see like how their language works, how they think, how their society lives, and I felt like that could have been explored even further. So yes, there's a lot of interesting world building things in here, and that was one of my favorite parts of the story overall. And as for the characters and their relationships, I think that was one of the stronger elements. Todd and Viola can be very frustrating. They're very flawed characters, especially with Todd. He is a very flawed character and makes a lot of mistakes, especially in the second book. I really appreciated all of that. I wanted to just dig in a little bit more because sometimes, again, his like character arc could feel a little bit repetitive, but overall he is a very, very interesting main character. I think he is very well complemented by the villains, by Viola. Seeing the dynamics between Todd and the town was very fascinating. Romance. I don't think it was necessary in this book series. I just did not see the romance between him and Viola. They seem to have a very strong bond, a very strong friendship, and I appreciated that and I really liked that. But then literally in the last third of the third book, they started having like romantic feelings and attraction towards each other, which was just very odd because they'd never had that before that point, and it honestly just didn't feel necessary to me, especially with how the third book ends. So the series ends with Todd basically in a coma. He's like attached to the land, but he's no longer in his body. We get a little bit of his internal thoughts, so we know that he's still in there somewhere, and Viola is basically like this crying virginal figure over him that is going to wait for him to return. I did not like that. I didn't think it was necessary. Overall, I give this series a 3 stars. I like a lot of the stuff in here, but for me, it just never reached the potential that I thought it could have, which I will discuss the potential in my next section, but it didn't struggle really with pacing or characters or plot. It just didn't feel like it was moving, which I felt like really would have benefited the series. It felt very self-contained, if that makes sense. But let's get into the potential of this series, into the discussion of does this book hold up today? I would say not really. I think that this series is very ambitious for a YA book that started getting published in 2008. There's no characters that are explicitly set as gay, but there are multiple characters that have had same-sex relationships. Like, there are gay characters on the page. They don't say that they're gay, but they are there, which is like kind of mind-blowing for a 2008 book. Like, just remember all the other books that came in 2008 that was not happening. This book's primary theme to me is all about toxic masculinity. Todd is coming from a very toxic town. He's living in a world where men can like hear each other's thoughts, where men can control each other. The series is all about power and male power, and kind of the characters that fall outside that power, the characters that have that power and choose not to use it. This is a regressive society, so of course there's like misogyny, probably some internalized homophobia, although it never quite goes there. And I think all of those elements play into this idea of the toxic masculinity that this book series is presenting and discussing. I think in that aspect it's very good and very interesting. For me, the big problem is that there's all these other themes that intersect with this idea of toxic masculinity, and those themes aren't really pushed and they don't really progress farther than just like a blip in the story, which is kind of unfortunate because I feel like if they had been explored, the toxic masculinity theme would have been pushed even farther, these other themes would have been pushed farther, and it would have made the book feel whole and complete. One of the big things about this book is that men naturally project their thoughts into the world. Only men do this, which is very odd because all the natural species, whether male or female, can do it, and the spackle, the alien species, all of them can do it no matter if they're male or female. So why does this book only have the male humans be able to do this? A lot of the societies that we see in this book, the women are powerless, the women are viewed as evil or conniving because they don't naturally share their thoughts, because they are kind of like a closed silence that people can't read. There's a lot of distrust towards women. There's a lot of characters that embody like very typical female tropes, how we view and represent women, which I think is all very purposeful. But again, those ideas of misogyny aren't really pushed. The character I think that embodies the witch, or like the evil female conniving character, is also kind of like a bad person, and she doesn't really get explored to the fullest in what it means for society to like view her in that really misogynistic way. The other big thing is that when you introduce themes of femininity, toxic masculinity, misogyny, especially when it's set in a magic system that is very much in a binary system, you expect some gender exploration. There are not any trans characters in this series. There are not any like male characters that can't project their thoughts. There are no female characters that can. It is very strict binary. There's nobody that lies in between, and that to me is just very weird because it seems like such a natural place to go with this series. So while there are discussions of like toxic masculinity and femininity and misogyny, it doesn't feel like it's pushed far enough because gender is never really deconstructed or explored, which just feels like the most obvious place for this series to go. I think if this series was written in 2021, it would be so weird if it didn't do that. So that's where the main reason of why this book doesn't really stand up to me in 2021. We see like a similar thing with The Power. The Power is like a adult sci-fi series where women suddenly gain the ability to throw lightning at each other or something like that. I can't remember. That book is really fascinating, but again, it never really pushes on the idea of gender and the gender binary, which just seems like such an obvious place for that series to go, especially when you're discussing themes of like misogyny and toxic masculinity. And the other big thing about the series, it's like, I wouldn't say it's exploring, but it's definitely touching on the idea of like colonialism, imperialism. You know, we have humans that are settling on an alien planet that are killing and destroying the alien race and species. There are very obvious allusions to historical things that happened in our own society with indigenous and native people. But the ending of this book kind of lands on the idea of, well, we're here now and we have to kind of learn to live together and make peace with one another, which like isn't a bad theme, but it never really gets explored to the fullest. In the series, we see the genocide of these alien people. Our main characters, other characters, kill these alien species. And by the third book, when we're finally getting the representation of the aliens in the physical text, when we're finally getting to the head of the problem of imperialism in the third book, when we're getting to the issue of war, it just kind of falls flat for me. I am not native, I'm not indigenous, so I can't speak on the representation itself, but from what I noticed, this is like what the rep looks like. So for the first two books, it's very absent. We barely get any of the alien characters. We get a little bit more in the second book, but again, most of that is just the violence against them. We are beginning to get an inklings of a main character, but we don't get that character's POV until the third book. And when we finally do get that alien perspective, alien voice, it's not the best in my opinion. Again, I can't speak to the accuracy of it, but basically the alien race of this land is like connected to the land. They are kind of like a uniform one body speaking. They kind of live so connected to the land that they can like communicate through each other. I just want to add that they also don't have names. They feel like there are one person connected through all these different bodies, so nobody has an actual name. The main character we get literally has a number that is given to him, and that's what he goes by through most of the novel. He later gets a name which is like The Return, and then there's another alien with the name The Sky, but they don't have names in their society, which like them not having names is also kind of really, really weird. The main POV for the alien race really struggles with the ideas of like identity and being like an individual, which is slightly revered as like a better thing that happened in the earthen society, but also he feels so disconnected from his own people that that is like a trauma that he's facing. And the main arc for that character is to kind of prove that, you know, violence is wrong, killing is wrong, it will just keep the circle of violence. And while, you know, the idea of like genocide, unequal power dynamics are kind of there, it it ultimately settles on, we can't keep making the circle of violence continue, which is like very rough coming from a character that has dealt with so much trauma, who doesn't get to see any kind of repercussions for the main characters, who doesn't get any retribution from these colonizers who are taking over his land. So along with like that dynamic, you have this people that are so connected to nature and the land in a very like spiritually sense. To me, it reminds me a lot of Pocahontas in like the bad way that people talk about it being the bad way. So I feel like that was not the best. And along with like the Pocahontas inklings, this book especially is all about evil on both sides, killing on both sides, and it reminds me of that song in Pocahontas. I know that song slaps, but like it's not a good look in 2021. You know, the Savages song where it's like savages, barely even human, and it's both sides viewing each other as savages. Like, yes, but also like there are power dynamics in that it is not just a battle of one against one. The line, they're not like you and me, which means they must be evil, like, yes, that works, but also like there's a lot more going on there, and that is really simplifying the issue of colonization and killing indigenous people. But you might be saying, this is an alien race, they don't look like us, they don't have darker skin, how can you be connecting it to indigenous people? The allegory is there, and it is very obvious, especially in this third book. Like, just the weapons that they use just are obviously supposed to be indigenous inspired. Again, going back to like that spirituality connection to the land, that is obviously a connection to how a lot of Americans think, you know, spirituality and religion works in indigenous communities. And I think Patrick Ness was specifically trying to go for that indigenous allegory. I think it's just really obvious. I respect the ambition there. You have these main characters who are a part of this race that is enslaving other races. So like, I really respect that he didn't like shy away from that point or just kind of gloss over it. He made the characters part of the novel. He didn't shy away from like the horrible things that happened to indigenous people, especially during colonialism. Like, he didn't shy away from that, and like that in itself is exceptional. But also, is the rep a little dated and feel a little simplified? Yes. And at the end of the day, it feels like the issue between colonialism, between these two different groups, is just very simplified into like the circle of violence, which yes, it is, but there's so much more there. This series, while very ambitious, just does not go to the places I think the series needed to go to reach that potential. So does this series hold up in 2021? From a just basic summary review standpoint, no, this is a middle of the road series. It's interesting, but there's nothing really that like drags me in and makes me love this plot, love this character. Nothing to really keep me thinking on this series once I kind of compartmentalize it in my mind. But looking from a more thematic standpoint, no. Like, I think there are better books now that deal with similar topics and talk about similar themes. But also, if Patrick Ness was writing this in 2021, I would like to think that he would write it a little bit differently and explore it a little bit differently. It's not that these issues didn't exist in 2008. We've been talking about these same topics for a very long time, but it's been taking a long time for them to be reflected in our literature. So at the end of the day, to me, this was ambitious, but it ultimately was very simplifying in a lot of aspects. That's where I stand on this. It's okay, and it doesn't necessarily stick up for a 2020 audience. Have you read this series? What are your thoughts and opinions on it? Are you going to be rereading it now because I've talked about it? Did anybody watch the movie? What were your thoughts? As well as, does anybody have books that are similar to this, that parallel this, that are written by diverse voices that are discussing these topics in depth? I would love some recommendations for that. I'm definitely going to be looking into that. I'm particularly interested in The Lesson, which is a first contact sci-fi story, which I believe takes place on a Caribbean island, but I know that it is talking about like indigenous people in contact with aliens and that kind of colonial allegory kind of thing. So yes, that's the book I'm looking forward to. But thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys later, and happy reading.